Hello, I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. Well, Missouri Southern has started a tradition of honoring elected officials with the Richard M. Webster Medallion. And today we're going to find out about the 2018 recipient, visit with him, and Gary Nodler joins me today. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And before we get into the interview and share some thoughts, I want to share a video with the audience from the day of the presentation in November. So at this point, we're going to take a short pause and let you look at the presentation of the Webster Medallion.
This was sort of a no-brainer. The first recipient since we brought back was Senator Richard, very well deserved, and then of course Senator Nodler was the obvious next person.
He was the spearhead of the name change to university when I was in the House, and it was his efforts that this happened out here, and he deserves it. And he's close friends with Senator Webster, so it's a good fit.
Well, of course, the elevation to university status was my principal objective when I went to the Senate, and it was a noteworthy achievement in two ways. The first is we achieved the objective. The other is Senator Webster once told me that the secret to success in the legislature is to build the myth. And when you get enough people to believe the myth, it becomes the reality. The Southern bill was thought to be impossible to pass, and that first success made it much easier to pass legislation after that. So Senator Webster's guidance had an effect on my career in the Senate.
Of course, you can see that it was a nice ceremony that day in the North Edmonton facility here at Missouri Southern. Share your feelings and reaction when you were notified that they were going to honor you this year.
Well, I was surprised. I hadn't thought about it, and I guess this is only the second time that it's happened, so it's kind of like the Hirschhold Awards at the Academy Awards. It doesn't happen every year. But it's a great honor, and as I said, I knew Senator Webster for a long time, and he's one of three senators whose portraits hang on the wall in the Senate lounge in the Capitol as a symbol of the institution's recognition that they're considered the three greatest senators in the history of our state. So I was extremely honored to represent his senatorial district and to have that legacy to try to build on.
Right. Of course, Senator Webster had a legacy, and a lot of what would you think are some of the key points that made him very successful, made him successful in Jefferson City?
Well, he was in an entirely different situation. I came in the first majority class for the Republican Party and never served in a minority status. And by the time I left office, we had overwhelming majorities in both the House and Senate. Senator Webster spent his entire career in a very small minority. And so in order to be effective and pass legislation from that minority position took tremendous political acumen and skill. There were actually 4 Southwest Missouri senators at one time. Senator Emory Melton from Cassville, Paul Bradshaw from Springfield, and John T. Russell from Lebanon. Actually, he was still there my first 2 years in the state Senate, so I had the opportunity to serve with Senator Russell. But those 4 were probably the most gifted senators in the Senate during the time that they served there. And even though they were in the small Republican minority, they were able to pass legislation and significantly impact on the flow of legislation. And so the degree to which he was able to have impact, like the original Missouri Southern College bill, to be able to accomplish that from a minority position is tremendous success, and I think makes him worthy of that recognition as one of the truly great senators in the history of our state.
Were there certain things that when you got to know him that you really wanted to emulate, or say, I like how he does this, or this is the way that things should be?
Well, I never thought that I could be like Dick Webster, where our personalities are somewhat different and our assets are different. But as I indicated in that interview, he told me really in our first professional meeting when I went to introduce myself to him as Congressman Taylor's field representative here in his district. He told me this story about how he accumulated his political power. And he said he had a relationship with a young reporter named Jim Wolfe, who wrote for the Joplin Globe, the St. Joseph newspaper, and then also had his column carried in small rural papers across the state. And he said that he and Jim crafted this myth that he, Dick Webster, was the most powerful senator in the state. And he said the minute that we got enough believers, it became reality. Mm-hmm. Well, when I first went to the Senate, of course, my objective was to get the name changed to university and obtain university status. And that did require a lot of effort and maneuvering. At that time, the senator from Columbia was the minority leader of the Democratic Party, and he was filibustering the bill. And so it took me about 3 weeks of communicating with Senator Ken Jacob before I persuaded him to actually stop the filibuster and become a co-sponsor of the Southern Name Change bill. And as a consequence of that, we were able to pass that bill with only 3 dissenting votes. And that was less than a month after I was sworn in. So it was a really unique set of circumstances that allowed that to happen. And I was conscious of Senator Webster's humorous comments about building the myth. And I thought with the passage of the Southern bill that we might have started to build a myth. And in point of fact, it was very easy after that to pass legislation because there was a perception then that I could pass bills. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like my first and only filibuster. I filibustered the AT&T bill when there were 30 co-sponsors of the bill. So they had enough votes to really kill the filibuster. But I was able to stop the bill and force a compromise between the telephone industry and the cable television industry, and we passed that bill the next year. The point is that filibuster became kind of a legend, and I basically started by giving a history of cable television, starting with the Neo show system when KBTN radio bought a couple of antennas and started rebroadcasting. And they thought at that point this was going to be a long speech, and so the sponsor laid the bill over. Well, from that point on, I never had another filibuster. And the reason was there was this myth about my ability to filibuster and kill bills. It just happened I'd been in the cable television industry, and I knew that area, but my colleagues weren't aware of that. So they thought that this was an innate ability to speak on any subject at any time. Of course, it wasn't, but the perception, the myth was there. And so all I had to do was threaten a filibuster, and it had the same effect as a real filibuster. So Webster's story, well, I think he intended it to be humorous, and it was, had a core of truth to it that proved to be pretty profound.
So some words of wisdom that really carried through in your career. Let's backtrack a little on your career. You mentioned working with the Congressman, Gene Taylor. Probably going beyond that, your initial interest in working in politics and public service. You actually attended Missouri Southern, graduated from Missouri Southern.
I did, and it's odd. We've just the date of this taping this filming is just a few days after November 22nd, and my real interest in history and politics came on November 22nd, 1963. I was in school, in intermediate school at Neosho, when Mrs. Stone, the principal, came on the loudspeaker, and it was the time of day she would normally announce the Girl Scout meetings and the social
daily
activities.
Events, right.
And she basically said that the president had been shot in Dallas and had died at 1 o'clock that afternoon, and I was absolutely stunned by that, and as everyone in the school was, and it caused me to realize that history isn't just something in books from the past. It's occurring every day, and that we have an opportunity to be a part of the making of history. And so my interest in politics really does go back to that moment. And so I was interested in high school and college and really through the rest of my life.
Of course, political science at Missouri Southern,
Right.
so pursuing that. And then working with the congressman, that opportunity to kind of work behind the scenes. People think, well, Washington, everything happens there, but you were representing his office here.
I was, and actually I was working in his first congressional campaign while I was a senior in college here. And he was very involved with Missouri Southern, as you know, one of the original trustees for Missouri Southern College. And his son was later a student here. And so that relationship with Missouri Southern was a positive in building my relationship with the congressman. And he offered me a position actually in Washington as his chief legislative assistant, but my draft lottery number was 21, and so I knew that I was going to be drafted shortly after graduation, so I was not able to accept that position. And in fact, I was drafted 9 days after graduation here. And so, but my duty date was deferred until January. So I actually went to basic training in Fort Leonard Wood in January of 1973. And while I was there, the war ended, the Paris Peace Accords were reached, and the U.S. forces began returning in dramatic numbers from Vietnam, and so they didn't need all of the folks that were in the pipeline.
Right.
So they had an option for anyone interested to go into a reserve component, a guard unit or a reserve unit, or complete their 18 months. And I was inclined to go ahead and do the 18 months and just get it out of the way, but I called Congressman Taylor and asked him if that job was still open, and he said, no, I hired a kid named Esterly from Carthage for that job, but my Joplin manager office is still open if you're interested in that. So I said, sure, and it actually was a great place to be, because for the staff, the politics is in the district. It's not in Washington.
That's where you're meeting constituents.
That's where the political life of the office takes place, and you interact with constituents, and you attend public meetings and become familiar with the area. And so it was a great education. And I also had the responsibility, really the opportunity, to meet the congressman at the airport and take him home on weekends and back to the airport early the next week. And those drives from Sarcoxie, mostly to Springfield, but sometimes to Joplin, were opportunities to just talk and chat. And it was like a postgraduate education, I can assure you.
You learned a lot just riding in the car with him, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And he was very probative. His questioning was deep and intense, and he expected his staff to know what was going on in the district. In fact, I asked him one time, how much do you want to know about the details? And I'll never forget, he said, I want to know when Aunt Minnie's got a hangnail. So he was really interested in and that really created a discipline on my part in learning about what the issues were, what was going on, what the prevalent opinion was. It was a great education.
Sounds like it really would have been a lesson in listening to people, and you're meeting the public, you're meeting the voters, the constituents. You are the person representing them.
Well, that's true, and the listening part is a key that eludes many politicians. Whether it's just a consciousness of the interests of the constituents, or whether it's being engaged in a debate, you've got to be able to listen. If you're in a debate, it's very difficult to win the debate if you haven't heard the argument of your adversary. And the reality is it's easier to deconstruct your opponent's argument than it is to formulate one of your own. And so I think that listening skill is absolutely critical. It's even more critical for the office holder to understand what the mind and spirit of his district is. And it's complex because you have all kinds of points of view. Oh, yeah. And so you have to discern not necessarily pure right or pure wrong, but you have to discern the consensus of the belief of the district. And the role of a congressman is very much immersed in reflecting public sentiment and public opinion. It's different for a senator. A senator, the Constitution contemplates, the senator in the state of Missouri is modeled after the senator in Washington. That is supposed to be a deliberative office, and it's much more akin to being a juror than it is to being a political advocate for the public that's elected you. A lot of people misunderstand that, and they think that senators ought to just react to popular opinion in the same way that congressmen do and should. And really, it's a different role with a different purpose.
Of course, being in Jefferson City, serving as a senator, you were working with a lot of different people and actually kind of worked into some leadership as well when you're talking about the majority positions that you had. So that listening must obviously played a role. It was recognized by some of your peers.
I was chosen to be the assistant majority floor leader in the middle of my first term, and it was the first majority leadership position for a Southwest Missouri senator, including Springfield, in more than 50 years. And part of that, of course, is we were establishing this new majority, and this Southwest Missouri area was a political stronghold for the Republicans for generations. And so I'd like to think some of it was my political skill, but some of it was a geographic recognition of the rights and the interest of the most Republican area of the state. I then became the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, and later the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And those positions, the education chairmanship wasn't really anything that I particularly pursued. So I think that there was a thought on the part of the leadership that my skill set matched that task in a way that I didn't recognize myself.
And those fit in nicely with your goal of Missouri Southern becoming a university and the whole funding aspect for higher education.
They did, and of course funding is a constant challenge for higher education. It's always been an easy target because of the ability to raise tuition. Of course, statutorily that was altered in Senate Bill 389, and as a result of that, the threat to budgets has continued, but the ability for institutions to develop their own resource base has been more limited. And that creates the environment that Missouri Southern and others face today. That's an ongoing challenge.
Ongoing, and of course that takes us to today. You're now with the Coordinating Board of Higher Education in the state of Missouri. John Q. Public's watching, and they said, well, what does the board do? How would you explain that to someone you run?
Well, the Coordinating Board is a board that oversees all of the state colleges and universities in the state, including the University of Missouri system. And the Coordinating Board basically oversees the activities of the Missouri Department of Higher Education. And so it's a corollary to the Missouri State School Board.
Okay.
In that sense. Missouri is what I would call a mixed state. Kansas has a single board of regents that governs all of the universities in the state. And then there are other states, I'm not sure, some of the southern states, I think perhaps Kentucky, I'm not certain of that. Every institution has its own governing board and they're all independent. And then there's this kind of mid structure where institutions have their own board, but then there's an overall governing, guiding, consulting board. I think Texas is very similar to Missouri in that regard. So, and of the three systems, I'm not sure which one is ideal, but I really like this system the best.
So in your role as a member of the board, what type of activities, something explaining to someone who's watching, what does the member of the coordinating board do?
Well, the coordinating board has to review and approve and submit the Department of Higher Education budget requests to the legislature, which include the budget requests from each individual institution in the state. The coordinating board also advises and directs the department on formulation of higher education policies. Missouri has had an interest in an effort to develop standards for outcomes. And we've also been moving for a few years toward a self-assessment requirement. So it's an objective that says to institutions, all right, create some goals for yourselves. create some measurement parameters, and then report back a factual basis for us to consider your progress as an institution. And so the Department of Education, under the guidance of the coordinating board, then reviews those plans, approves, suggests modifications, and then develops an overall set of higher education objectives for the entire Missouri higher education system. And that is a process that is still in the making. We don't have a finished product on how we go about assessing outcomes in our state. So really, that's one of the two most important functions of this coordinating board. First, to determine budget priorities and to formally submit the request to the legislature. And second, to come up with a cogent, meaningful, logical way to assess how well institutions are meeting the goals set for them by the state and the goals that they've set for themselves.
So really a lot of accountability tying into
That's the objective, is accountability and meaningful measurement of results.
And of course, when you look at the universities around the state, you mentioned the University of Missouri system being the largest, and then smaller universities such as Missouri Southern, some of the others. You have a wide variety of schools involved with higher education.
Wide variety, and we have some variety within the university system. That's another interesting, I think, issue, although it's not been debated widely. There are actually 4 separate campuses, and they have their own chancellors and their own football teams and basketball teams. And they're really, in many ways, separate universities, but they're under the umbrella of the Missouri University system. And I'm not sure whether the coordinating board or the legislature has really examined how that system reports to the legislature and to the governor and to the coordinating board and to the department. I'm not sure it wouldn't make more sense for that report to come from each of those 4 campuses individually, and then to have a separate system-wide report from the system office that deals with all of the system issues.
Well, this being a time of challenges for higher education, do you foresee changes in the future of Missouri as far as dealing with some of these challenges?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think we have to find a way to meet the costs of providing higher education while recognizing affordability issues and not sacrificing quality. The truth is, we're competing with universities all over the world. And the educational environment, as you know, changes daily. I'm not sure the number of students at Missouri Southern that are obtaining their degrees online. I had a nephew that did that. He was from the state of Texas, but he has a Missouri Southern State University degree that he obtained through online education. I think not only for Southern, but for all institutions, that is an intricate part of the future of education, and perhaps for K through 12 as well. So we have to recognize changing technology and changing learning modes for students as they become more involved with phones and smart tablets and all of those technologies. And I think that's going to be a challenge that takes more than a little strategic thinking to plan for.
So the world is changing, and so is education. If someone were to ask you, maybe one of our younger members here at the university still attending school, political science major, what would you say is the key for success? If, say, somebody comes up to you, one of our majors, and says, I'd like to someday get into public office, what would be a key or advice you would give to them?
Well, I'd say when I first graduated from high school and started college, I thought, as many people did in that day, that you went to school, you obtained a body of knowledge that then prepared you for work and for life. And in retrospect, I think what you learn is how to learn. And learning is a lifelong experience. And I think the purpose of a college or university education is to equip you for that lifelong mission to continue to learn, expand, improve, and question. And so in that sense, I don't know that you ever really graduate.
Then lifelong learning continues
Lifelong
no
learning.
matter what your role is.
And in the field of politics, that is certainly true, because you can't do any of the things that a politician is expected to do without being in the process of learning every minute of every day.
And So no matter what your job is in political situations as well, learn, explore, and look
Right.
to the future.
And it's as much of a key to know what you don't know as it is to be confident in what you know.
They've tied them all together. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and congratulate you once again on receiving this award.
Thank you for
Missouri
having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I always like to be on campus. It's very different from my days as a student.
Well, I know you're still very active at Missouri Southern. We see you at basketball games, so you're a strong Missouri Southern supporter as well.
And football.
Football as well.
Win, lose, or draw, I go to the games.
Well, thank you very much for visiting and sharing with us in the audience today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for joining us this week on Newsmakers. I'm Judy Stiles. I hope you can join me again next week at the same time on this station. We'll see you then.